It is the summer of 86 BC. The sun has barely cleared the ridgeline above Boeotia, and already the air tastes like iron and dust. You are a Roman soldier. You have marched for months through hostile Greek territory, survived a brutal siege, watched your friends die outside the walls of Athens, and now you stand on a low hill above the plain of Chaeronea, and you look out at what is waiting for you on the other side of the valley. And what you see stops your heart. A forest of spears, an ocean of bronze, a living wall of men so vast that its edges disappear into the morning haze on both sides of the valley, as if the earth itself has grown teeth. Somewhere out there, war drums are beating with a rhythm so deep, you feel it in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Banners in colours you have never seen snap in the dry Boeotian wind. The horses alone, the thousands upon thousands of Pontic cavalry, create a thunder when they shift that sounds like distant mountains collapsing. You count, you try to count, you stop counting. There are 120,000 of them. There are 30,000 of you. Let that sink in for a moment. 4-1. Some historians push the ratio even higher. 5-1, maybe more. On one side of this valley stands the largest eastern army, assembled since Alexander's enemies marched against Macedonia. On the other side stands a Roman force that has no legal right to even be here, commanded by a general that his own government has declared a public enemy, fighting a war that nobody in Rome officially authorized. And yet, see, here is the question that has haunted military historians for over 2,000 years. How do you take 30,000 exhausted, outnumbered, politically abandoned soldiers and turn them into the instrument of the most complete battlefield massacre the ancient world had ever recorded? How does discipline beat numbers that badly? If you have ever wondered what Roman legions were actually capable of at their absolute peak, if you have ever questioned whether the stories of ancient battles are exaggerated propaganda or genuine history, stay with me. Because what happened on this plain in the summer of 86 BC is either the greatest military achievement in Republican Roman history, or it is the most audacious lie ever told by a victorious general. Either way, it changed the ancient world forever. I am so glad you are here for this one. I seriously, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from. We have viewers from every continent on this channel, and every time I ask, the answers blow my mind. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button, because we do this every week. Deep dives into the battles that actually shaped civilization, told the way they deserve to be told. Now, let's go back to Chaeronea. To understand why 120,000 soldiers were standing in a Greek valley waiting to destroy a Roman army, you need to understand one man, one massacre, and one catastrophic failure of Roman arrogance. The man was Mithridates VI of Pontus, king of a kingdom on the southern shores of the Black Sea, a place Rome had always viewed as a minor irritant on the edges of the civilized world. But Mithridates was not minor, and he was not irritating. He was brilliant, polyglot. Ancient sources claim he spoke 22 languages, and he had spent decades building an army while Rome was busy fighting everyone else. He had watched Rome bleed through the social war, the brutal conflict from 91 to 88 BC, in which Rome's Italian allies rose up and nearly tore the Republic apart. And when Rome was at its weakest, gasping for breath, still counting its dead, Mithridates moved. He did not just invade Roman territory in Asia Minor. He invited every Roman and Italian settler in the province to a feast, and then had them slaughtered on the same night. 80,000 people, men, women and children, killed in a single coordinated massacre that Cassius Dio recorded with cold horror. In a single evening, See, Mithridates had announced to the Mediterranean world that the rules had changed. This was not a border dispute. This was not a negotiation. This was a declaration that Rome's empire could be unmade, that Rome's people could be wiped from the earth, and that the king of Pontus was the man to do it. Athens heard the message and welcomed him with open arms. That detail still staggers the imagination. Athens, the philosophical heart of the ancient world, the city that Rome claimed to venerate above all others, the birthplace of democracy, opened its gates to Mithridates' general Archelaus and allowed the tyrant Aristion to seize power in the name of Pontic liberation. Other Greek cities followed. The south of Greece, a region that had been under Roman influence for decades, erupted in anti-Roman rebellion almost overnight. What Mithridates had understood, and what Rome had catastrophically failed to grasp, was that Roman rule in Greece was not loved, it was endured. The tax collectors, the debt collectors, the casual contempt of Roman administrators, all of it had been building pressure for years, and Mithridates simply gave that pressure somewhere to explode. Into this catastrophe walked Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Do not let anyone tell you Sulla was a hero. Do not let anyone tell you he was a villain. He was something far more complicated and far more dangerous, a man of absolute capability who had stripped away every loyalty except one, loyalty to his own judgment. In 88 BC, the Roman Senate had given him command of the war against Mithridates. Then, a political deal between his rival Marius and the tribune Sulpicius stripped that command away. So Sulla did something no Roman general had ever done before. He turned his army around and marched it on Rome. He expelled his enemies at sword point. He killed the tribune. He restored his command by force. And then he left, knowing that the moment his back was turned, his enemies would seize the city again. They did. Marius returned. Sulla was declared a public enemy, his name struck from Roman law, his command stripped a second time. On paper, the army now standing above the plain of Chaeronea had no legal commander, was fighting an unauthorized war, and was composed of men who, technically under Roman law, were traitors. Sulla never acknowledged any of this, not once, not in any letter, not in any dispatch, not in the memoirs he wrote later that became the primary source for Plutarch and Appian. He fought as if Rome's declaration of his outlaw status was a minor administrative inconvenience. That quality, the absolute refusal to accept the legitimacy of his own destruction, was the same quality that would win him this battle. And Archelaus. Archelaus had retreated north from Athens after Sulla cracked the city open in March of 86 BC. A siege so brutal and so efficient that it left parts of Athens burning for days. The Pontic general was not stupid. He knew that his cavalry and his phalanx were devastating on open ground, and he had been manoeuvring to find exactly that, a wide, open plain where his numbers could spread like a flood and simply drown whatever the Romans put in front of him. He had 2 additional Pontic armies converging on his position from Thessaly and Macedonia, commanded by a general named Taxiles. When those forces merged with his own, Archelaus would command an army that, by every calculation known to ancient military science, should have been unstoppable. But here, right here, is where we need to pause. Because before we go any further, we should talk about what we actually know and what we don't. The primary sources for Chaeronea are Plutarch, writing roughly 150 years after the battle, and Appian, writing even later in the 2nd century AD. Both drew heavily on Sulla's own memoirs, which Plutarch himself described as vague and boastful. Sulla had every reason to inflate the enemy's numbers. A general who defeated 60,000 men is talented. A general who defeated 120,000 with 30,000 of his own is a demigod. The ancient world understood propaganda as well as any modern spin doctor, and Sulla was a master of it. Modern historians like Delbruck have suggested the Pontic force may have been closer to 60,000. Still a crushing numerical superiority, but a far cry from the legendary figures. Other scholars split the difference at 80,000. The truth is, we will never know exactly how many men stood on that plain. What we know for certain is this: there were vastly more of them than Romans. The ratio was not in Rome's favour, and what was about to happen defied every military expectation of the ancient world. Now let's talk about what those armies actually looked like, and why the ground beneath their feet was going to matter more than anyone except Sulla understood. Stand on the plain of Chaeronea today, and you will see farmland, the wheat fields, a gentle river threading through a flat-bottomed valley, hemmed in on both sides by ridges and mountains that rise with the abruptness of walls rather than the graduality of hills. It is peaceful now, quiet, the kind of landscape that makes you think nothing of consequence has ever happened here. But stand there in the early summer of 86 BC, and the geography would have told you an entirely different story. The valley is perhaps 4 miles wide at its broadest point, compressed on the north by the rocky mass of Mount Hedelium, and on the south by the slopes of Mount Thurium. The river Cephisus runs roughly east to west across the valley floor, shallow enough to wade in summer, but capable of turning soft ground into mud that swallows sandals and slows formations. At the western end of the valley, where the mountains pinch together, stands the town of Chaeronea itself, perched on a low acropolis that commands the only reliable road in from the west. At the eastern end, the valley opens slightly before squeezing again near the town of Orchomenos. This terrain was not neutral. It was a trap, but the trap could be sprung in either direction, depending on who controlled the high ground and who moved first. Sulla saw it immediately. He had been in Greece long enough to develop an intimate understanding of how this landscape fought, how it favoured infantry over cavalry, how the ridgelines created corridors of movement that could be sealed or opened by whoever occupied the right hilltop. The hill of Parapetami, at the western end of the valley where it narrowed near the Cephisus, was the key. Whoever held that position controlled the entry to the valley from the west. It was, as one ancient commentator described it, almost impregnable, and both Archelaus and Sulla recognized it at the same moment. What followed was something almost comical in its intensity. A foot race between two armies to see who could put men on a hill first. Sulla's soldiers won, and with that single act of controlled urgency, the tactical geometry of the entire battle shifted in Rome's favour before a single spear had been thrown. Archelaus was now hemmed into a position from which he could only advance eastward toward Chaeronea, fighting at an angle that reduced the effectiveness of his wider formation. His cavalry, which was his most devastating asset, needed open ground and room to build momentum. The valley gave him some of that room, but not as much as he needed. His phalanx needed flat, uninterrupted ground to maintain the locked sarissa formation that made it lethal. The valley gave him some of that too, but the riverbank on the north and the mountain slope on the south created natural boundaries that Sulla could use to anchor his flanks and prevent being overlapped. Sulla had also made another move of quiet brilliance earlier in the campaign. He had sent his legate Gabinius south with a full legion to occupy the town of Chaeronea itself before Archelaus could seize it. This secured the western approach, protected Sulla's supply lines into Thessaly, and denied the Pontic army a fortified position at the narrowest part of the valley. It was the kind of logistical thinking that separates competent generals from exceptional ones, controlling not just the battlefield, but the approaches to the battlefield weeks before the battle happened. Now let's look at the two forces that would fill this valley with blood. On the Roman side, 5 legions, veterans every one of them, hardened by the social war, and then by the brutal siege of Athens. Estimates put Sulla's total force at somewhere between 25 and 30,000 effectives. His infantry were equipped in the standard late Republican fashion, the heavy scutum, the large rectangular shield that could lock into a wall with neighbouring shields, the pilum, the the weighted javelin designed to bend on impact so that it could not be thrown back. And the gladius, the short thrusting sword that was at its most lethal in the press of close quarters, combat where longer weapons became useless. These were not men who threw things at a distance and hoped. These were men who got close, got inside the reach of longer weapons and killed with brutal personal efficiency. The allied Greek infantry added perhaps 5,000 more. Sulla's cavalry numbered around 1,500, far fewer than Archelaus commanded, and he knew it. On the Pontic side, the composition was a world unto itself. Archelaus had assembled a force drawn from across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The core of his infantry was a phalanx of 15,000 men equipped in the Macedonian tradition. Sarissas, the extraordinary spears that ran to 18 or 20 feet in length, held at an angle so that 5 ranks of points projected ahead of the front rank like a moving hedge of steel. Against an enemy that held its nerve and its formation, a sarissa phalanx on flat ground was one of the most destructive forces in the ancient world. It did not fight so much as it rolled, a geometric engine of weight and points that could grind through lighter formations the way a millstone grinds grain. Supporting the phalanx were 20,000 skirmishers drawn from across Asia, archers, slingers, light infantry who could shower an advancing enemy with missiles before the heavy infantry made contact. There were 2,000 cavalry, Pontic and Scythian horsemen who were accustomed to the step tactics of envelopment, riding wide around an enemy's flanks and striking from behind. And then there were the scythed chariots. The chariots deserve a moment of attention because they were the weapon that ancient sources mention with a kind of fascinated horror. These were not transport vehicles. They were killing machines, fitted with iron blades projecting horizontally from the axles, designed to drive at speed through tight infantry formations and cut men apart at the knees. They had worked with devastating effect against lighter Eastern armies. Against a Roman legion? That was a question nobody had yet answered. And somewhere in Sulla's mind a plan was forming. There was also an elite unit within the Pontic force called the Bronze Shields, heavily armed and heavily armoured veteran infantry who served as the fist inside the phalanx's glove. These were the soldiers who would go wherever the line was breaking. They were the men Archelaus trusted to seal breaches, to turn reversals, to personally ensure that whatever tactical problem arose was solved through sheer violence. Sulla deployed his forces with the kind of precise clarity that suggests he had walked this ground in his mind many times before the actual battle. He took command of the right wing himself. His legate Murena commanded the left. Hortensius and Galba held the reserve cohorts in the rear. Hortensius on the left side of the reserve, Galba on the right, ready to move in either direction as the battle demanded. The town of Chaeronea, already secured by Gabinius, anchored the far right of the Roman position. The night before the battle was something that no ancient source records with any precision, and yet we can feel it in every line that has survived. Somewhere in the Roman camp, in the darkness 2 hours before the fires burned down to coals, a soldier was sharpening his gladius against a whetstone. Not because it needed sharpening, he had done it 3 times already, but because the sound was familiar and the repetition was calming. He was thinking about the farm outside Capua, about the smell of bread his mother made in the morning, about a dog he had not seen in 4 years and wondered if it was still alive. Around him, thousands of other men were performing their own private rituals, cleaning armour, checking sandal straps, murmuring prayers to Mars and Fortuna and the household gods of homes they were not sure they would ever see again. Fortuna. The Romans did not pray to Fortune as an abstraction. They prayed to her the way a sailor prays to the sea, acknowledging that she was real, that she was present, that she could undo everything skill and courage had built in a single moment of her turning away. Tonight, they needed her to stay very, very close. Across the valley, the Pontic camp was a different sound entirely, louder, more confident, Drums were still beating in the darkness. Fires burned high and wide, a display of abundance, of numbers, of the casual certainty of men who believed they could not lose. They outnumbered the Romans 4-1, possibly 5-1. They had weapons the Romans had never faced at this scale. They had horses, chariots, the deep phalanx wall that had ended armies before. The laughter from their camp carried across the valley on the night wind. Sulla walked the perimeter of his camp alone that night. No source records it, but every account of the man suggests it is exactly what he would have done. Moving through the darkness with the deliberate quiet of a predator, checking his own reasoning one more time, looking out across the valley at those fires, calculating. He had chosen this ground. He had chosen this moment. He had refused battle at every position before this one, retreating, manoeuvring, frustrating Archelaus for weeks, waiting for the terrain that would negate the Pontic numbers. Now he had it. The valley was his trap. The phalanx would have to come to him. The chariots would not have the run-up they needed. The cavalry would be hemmed in by the riverbank and the mountain slope. The plan was set. Dawn was coming. The silence came first. That is the detail that gets lost in every dramatic retelling of ancient battles, the silence that precedes the noise. The drums stopped. The morning wind died. The 30,000 Romans on the western ridge and the vast Pontic host on the valley floor both seemed to hold their breath at the same instant, as if the earth itself had paused to acknowledge what was about to happen on its skin. Then a Roman trumpet sang 3 ascending notes, and the world ended. The sound that followed was not loud at first. It built, the way a storm builds, gathering layers as it approached. The first layer was the rhythmic crash of 60,000 Roman sandals hitting the dry Greek earth in lockstep, a sound that had no natural equivalent, a drumming without drums that you felt in the soles of your feet before your ears processed it. The second layer was metal, the low, continuous susurration of thousands of shields and armour pieces shifting and scraping against each other in motion, a sound like a river made of bronze. The third layer was the Pontic response, war cries in a dozen languages, a cacophony of sound that rose from the eastern end of the valley and crashed against the hills on both sides like water against stone. And under all of it, the smell, iron and sweat and horse dung and the sharp green smell of crushed grass. And underneath everything, something that no language has an adequate word for, the scent of fear from 50,000 bodies preparing to kill or be killed, a biological broadcast of adrenaline and cortisol that the ancient Romans would have recognized as the particular smell of the gods watching closely. Archelaus opened with his chariots, as it was the obvious choice. The chariot charge was his shock weapon, his opening statement, the device designed to shatter Roman formation before the phalanx even made contact. Hundreds of the iron-wheeled machines rolled forward from the Pontic lines, their axle blades glinting in the early morning light, their horses trained for exactly this moment, drivers screaming encouragement as they built towards speed. But Sulla was already moving. He had anticipated this. Perhaps he had even planned for it. The moment the chariots began to roll, Sulla advanced his entire line, not in a charge, but in a controlled, deliberate march forward. He was closing the distance, robbing the chariots of their run-up, making the valley work for him. Plutarch records that the Romans watched the chariots rolling toward them with gathering speed, and Sulla's infantry did not break, did not scatter, did not do the rational thing that every human instinct screamed at them to do. They opened their ranks and let the chariots through. The first machines rolled into the gaps between Roman cohorts and passed harmlessly through, their blades spinning through empty air, their drivers suddenly aware that they were surrounded, deep inside a Roman formation, with enemies on all sides and nowhere to go. The light infantry, The velites and allied skirmishers closed in from both sides and destroyed them with javelins and spears. It was over in minutes. What had been the most feared weapon on the field became a confused, screaming mass of dying horses and broken wood, picked apart by men who had simply refused to panic. Plutarch records that the Roman soldiers began to laugh, that they clapped and called out for more, the way circus crowds called for more racing, that the sound of their mockery, audible even over the din of battle, reached the Pontic lines and settled into the minds of men who had expected Romans to break. But the Romans had not broken, and the chariots were gone. By the first hour of full daylight, the two main lines had made contact across most of the valley. The phalanx hit Murena's left wing like a wall. 15,000 sarissas levelled and locked, the bronze shields of the Macedonian-style infantry catching the morning sun and throwing it back in blinding fragments. From a distance, the phalanx in motion was almost beautiful, precise, geometric, a moving architectural structure that seemed to belong to mathematics rather than war. Up close, it was a different experience entirely. Each sarissa was 18 to 20 feet long, 5 ranks of them projected ahead of the front rank, which meant the first Roman soldier who encountered the phalanx was not facing one spear, but 5, all aimed at his chest from varying distances. The only way through a properly formed phalanx was to survive that initial contact, get inside the spears, and close to gladius range, which required breaking the geometric perfection of the formation itself. Murena's men tried. They were good soldiers, experienced, disciplined, trained for exactly this kind of contact. But the weight of numbers was real. The Pontic phalanx pressed forward with the slow, relentless momentum of a millstone. And the Roman left began to give ground. Not breaking, the Romans did not break, but bending, stepping back, finding their shields being pushed up and back by the pressure of sarissa, points they could not quite get past. Simultaneously, Archelaus sent his cavalry around the northern flank, using the narrower ground along the Cephisus riverbank to probe for the edge of the Roman line. And from the slopes of Mount Thurium in the south, a Pontic detachment moved to seize the high ground that anchored Sulla's right flank. Hortensius, commanding the reserve and watching his left, saw the cavalry probing and moved to intercept, but in doing so, he advanced too far from the Roman line, and the Pontic cavalry swung around him. For a terrible few minutes, Hortensius and his reserve cohorts were in genuine danger of being cut off and surrounded on the flank of the battle, isolated from Sulla's main force, potentially destroyed before they could contribute anything to the fight. The Roman left was bending. The Roman reserve was nearly encircled. The phalanx was grinding forward, but the mountain detachment on Thurium had encountered soldiers already waiting for them. Sulla, anticipating exactly this move, had sent a unit of Romans through the mountain passes the night before, using local guides who knew paths that the Pontic scouts had not found. They hit the Pontic detachment on Thurium from above and behind, and drove them off the slope with significant losses. The southern flank was secure, but in the north, Hortensius was still in trouble. And Murena's left wing was still under enormous pressure, and somewhere in the middle of all of this, the battle was threatening to fragment into a series of simultaneous disasters. By mid-morning, Sulla understood that the battle had reached the moment he had been preparing for, not the moment of victory, but the moment just before, the hinge point, where everything could go either direction, and where a commander's personal judgment was the only thing between order and catastrophe. He was on the right wing. The Roman right, under Sulla's personal command, had not yet been seriously engaged. The terrain on the right side, the slopes above the town of Chaeronea, anchored by Gabinius's legion in the town itself, was too broken and elevated for the Pontic cavalry to use effectively. Mardan Archelaus had concentrated his main thrust on the centre and left. So Sulla sat on the right wing, with a battle raging to his left, and the sound of his left flank asking for help, echoing down the valley walls like an accusation. He made the decision to go. He took his own unit and the 5th cohort, his personal command group, and rode hard toward the left, toward Murena, toward the sound of the bronze shields of the Pontic elite infantry carving through Roman positions. The dust his movement raised was visible across the entire battlefield. The Pontic standard-bearers saw it. Archelaus saw it, and Archelaus did exactly what a brilliant, experienced general would do. He abandoned his own position and drove his forces hard against the now leaderless Roman right wing. The Roman right wing, deprived of its commander in the middle of an active battle, faced the personal onslaught of Archelaus himself, the best officer in the Pontic army, leading his best cavalry in a thundering charge against men who had not yet seen serious fighting, and who, whatever their discipline, must have felt the sudden cold absence of Sulla's presence at their shoulder. And here is where the story reaches the moment that Plutarch tells with visible amazement. Sulla heard it. He heard the screaming from the right. Some ancient sources say he heard men calling his name across the distance of the battlefield, pleading across the valley walls. Others say he saw the dust change, saw the standards shift, and understood in an instant what Archelaus had done. He was between two disasters. The left was breaking. The right was now under assault. He had divided his personal force at exactly the wrong moment and left both wings more vulnerable than before. This was the abyss, the point at which the entire Roman position could have collapsed into irreversible rout. Sulla made two decisions simultaneously. He sent Hortensius, whose forces he had extracted from danger moments before, directly to Murena on the left, and he himself turned around and rode back to the right. Back across the entire width of the battle, past the dying and the struggling and the lines that were bending and the spaces where men had fallen. Back to the right wing, where his soldiers were still standing. They were still standing, fighting without him, holding the line by will alone. He arrived at the right wing and found it intact. Fragments, simply fragments. Sure, what followed in the next minutes cannot be compressed into clean sentences, and it should not be. Archelaus had committed. His cavalry was at full extension, pressing against the Roman right, and Sulla hit them from behind their own momentum. The Roman right, stiffened by Sulla's return, stopped bending and started pushing back. The cavalry, caught between a counter-attacking Roman right and the geography of the hill slope above Chaeronea, had no room to turn, no room to build a countercharge. They broke. When the Pontic right wing broke, it did not simply retreat, it disintegrated. The cavalrymen, who had been pressing the Roman right with such confidence 60 seconds earlier, were now running in 4 directions at once, their formation destroyed, their horses responding to the panic of their riders with the blind. The uncontrolled gallop of animals that have decided the only important thing in the world is to be somewhere else. The infantry units that had been following the cavalry, waiting for the breakthrough that would let them pour through the Roman flank, found themselves standing in the open with their cavalry gone and a line of Roman soldiers already accelerating into a charge coming toward them. Sulla did not wait. He drove the cohorts forward. The collapse on the Pontic right sent a ripple through the entire Pontic formation that moved from right to centre in the time it takes to draw a breath. The phalanx in the centre, still grinding against Murena's left, still technically advancing, began to get information from its right side. First, it came as noise, the wrong kind of noise, with the absence of friendly cavalry sound where friendly cavalry should have been. Then it came as visual, men running, the wrong direction through the gap where the right wing had been. Then it came as pressure from an unexpected direction. Sulla's victorious right-wing cohorts, pivoting left and driving into the phalanx's exposed flank. A phalanx is invincible from the front. From the flank, it is almost helpless. The sarissa is a two-handed weapon. It points forward. The soldiers carrying it are locked into a geometric formation that requires every man to stay in his precise position relative to every other man, because the entire effectiveness of the weapon depends on that geometric precision. When something hits the phalanx from the side, the men on the outer edge have to choose between turning to face the new threat, which breaks the formation, and holding their position facing forward, which means standing still while someone kills them from behind. The Pontic phalanx had held its formation against Murena's frontal assault for the better part of an hour through sheer weight of numbers and the terrifying reach of the Sarissa. But it could not hold a flank attack from Sulla's right wing, while simultaneously absorbing Murena's renewed pressure from the front. Not with tired muscles and the sight of the right wing already gone. Not with the sounds of cavalry running in the wrong direction, reaching the rear ranks, and spreading the particular species of information that has no antidote. The knowledge that something behind you has already been lost. The phalanx began to come apart from the right edge inward, not quickly, not all at once. But the geometric precision that made it lethal required everyone to believe in it simultaneously, and belief was the first casualty of a flank attack in full view of 10,000 other men. By the afternoon, the centre was collapsing, and when the centre collapsed, it collapsed toward the camp. Phase 5. Collapse and Pursuit. The Pontic camp was behind them at the eastern end of the valley, surrounded on three sides by the rocky terrain that Archelaus had chosen for its defensive properties, and that was now the instrument of his destruction. There was nowhere to go. The valley walls pressed in from both sides. Sulla's right wing was coming from the west. Murena's left was finally advancing after holding for so long. The mountain slopes on both sides channeled the fleeing Pontic formations into a corridor that narrowed as they ran east, compressing them together, slowing them, making them easier to catch and easier to kill. What followed was not a battle. It was a pursuit, and then it was a massacre. The Roman legions, who had been fighting for hours, who were tired, whose legs were burning and whose arms were heavy, found some reserve of velocity in the chase that nobody who has not experienced it can quite explain. There is something that happens to soldiers when a battle tips definitively in their direction, when the enemy begins to run in earnest, when the air changes from the quality of survival to the quality of victory. And whatever that thing is, it moves through an army like a current and produces speed from men who had no speed left. The Pontic soldiers ran into their own camp and found no refuge there. The rocky ground that had looked like protection when they were setting up tents now looked like a cage. The narrow entrance to the camp became a choke point where men pushed against men, and the ones in front could not move, and the ones behind could not stop. And the Roman cavalry, now finally in a fight where they could use their mobility, drove into the flanks of the mass of men and did what cavalry does to trapped infantry. Ancient sources record that only 10,000 men of the Pontic army made it out of that camp and to the sea, where Archelaus had boats waiting. 10,000. Out of an army that had numbered, by even the most conservative modern estimates, between 60 and 120,000 men the previous day. Now the rest lay on the plain of Chaeronea, and in the approaches to the camp, and in the narrow corridors between the rocks where men had tried to squeeze through and failed. The sun went down on a silence. The field stank. That is not a dramatic embellishment. That is what ancient sources tell us, and it is something that every military historian who has studied ancient battlefields confirms. The aftermath of a large engagement in summer heat produced a sensory environment that was unlike anything in ordinary human experience. Blood dries to a dark rust colour in direct sunlight and gives off a smell that is nothing like what people expect. Sweet and heavy and wrong in ways that take days to forget. In 10,000 horses and men and horses feed, and the physical chemistry of fear and death mixed together under a Boeotian sun and produce something that the Greeks had a specific word for, a word they used in tragedy to describe the smell of divine punishment. Sulla reported in his own memoirs that he had lost 12 soldiers. Read that again. 12. Appian and Plutarch both record this figure with a kind of deadpan precision that suggests they were transmitting it exactly as Sulla wrote it, without fully endorsing it. Appian adds the helpful detail that 2 of the missing soldiers actually returned to camp by nightfall, making the net loss a possible 10, against 110,000 enemy dead. Let's be honest about what this is. This is propaganda. Sulla understood something that modern political consultants understand, that the most audacious lie, told with absolute confidence, occupies a different psychological space than a merely large lie. 12 Romans dead against 110,000 Pontic corpses is not a military report. It is a religious statement. It is Sulla announcing to the ancient world that the gods were literally on his side, that divine favour had made Roman casualties mathematically impossible, that fighting against Sulla's army was not a tactical problem but a metaphysical one. The real casualty figures for the Roman side will never be known. The nature of the fighting, extended close-quarters combat between heavy infantry over the course of a full day, makes any figure below several hundred essentially impossible to believe. Modern historians suggest Roman losses of perhaps 1 to 3,000 with additional wounded. That is still an extraordinary ratio against even the conservative estimate of Pontic losses, but it is a military achievement, not a miracle. What we know with more confidence is the fate of the leaders. Archelaus escaped. He reached his ships with the remnant of his army and sailed to the island of Euboea, which his fleet had controlled throughout the campaign. He did not surrender. He did not petition for terms. He spent the winter on Euboea, watching the island, maintaining his naval presence and sending raiding parties against Roman supply lines and coastal allies. He was still a general. He was still a threat. And he was already writing letters to Asia Minor, to Mithridates, to the supply depots and military reserves that the Pontic Empire maintained across the Aegean. Archelaus was already planning to come back. Sulla, meanwhile, entered Thebes, which had supported Mithridates, and was received with the terrified compliance of a city that had just watched what happened to enemies. He held victory games there, elaborate events that served multiple functions simultaneously, celebrating the win, demonstrating the army's continued vitality, and broadcasting across the Greek world that Roman power had not just survived, but had been violently confirmed. During these games, or shortly afterward, news arrived that a Roman officer named Lucius Valerius Flaccus had landed in Epirus with 2 legions sent by the legitimate Roman government, Sulla's enemies, to replace him as commander, Sulla's government. The people who had declared him an outlaw, they had sent someone to take his army. He read the dispatch and returned to the games. The battlefield of Chaeronea, in those days after the fighting, was being processed by the survivors. The local people of Boeotia, civilians who had watched the armies move through their fields and their towns for weeks, emerged to do what civilians have always done after battles: look for the living among the dead, collect what could be salvaged, begin the immense labour of burial that ancient Greek culture demanded for its own dead and frequently denied to its enemies. Plutarch, who was born in Chaeronea generations later, and who grew up hearing stories of that day passed down through his family's memory, wrote about the trophies that Sulla erected on the battlefield. 3 of them, at the sites of the major Roman victories within the engagement, inscribed with the names of the gods, Ares and Nike and Aphrodite, Mars and victory and love. Strange combination. Strange gods to honour on a field that smelled of death. The river Cephissus ran darker than usual for several days, and somewhere on the island of Euboea, Archelaus began to receive messengers from Asia Minor. 80,000 fresh soldiers were being gathered by a general named Dorylaeus, another of Mithridates' commanders. Ships were being assembled to move them west. The war was not over. It had barely made its first real statement. Within months, Archelaus would have a new army nearly as large as the one he had just lost, and Sulla would have to do this all over again at a place called Orchomenos, in the same Boeotian landscape, against the same enemy. But that is a different story. Chaeronea did not end the war, but it ended something more important than the war. In the spring of 85 BC, roughly a year after the blood dried on that Boeotian plain, Mithridates VI of Pontus sat down with Lucius Cornelius Sulla at a place called Dardanus and signed a peace treaty that required him to give back every piece of Roman territory he had seized, surrender 70 warships, pay an indemnity of 2,000 talents, and watch the man he had spent 4 years trying to destroy ride away to Italy with his army intact and his prestige higher than it had ever been. Mithridates had started this war believing that Rome could be broken while it was distracted. Chaeronea had answered that belief with definitive violence, but the deeper consequences reached far beyond the Pontic kingdom. What Sulla brought back to Italy in 83 BC was not just a victorious army, it was proof that a Roman general with loyal veteran legions could challenge the state itself, march on Rome, declare his own enemies the real traitors, fight and win against impossible odds in a foreign land, and return with enough prestige and military force to reshape Roman political life entirely. He did exactly that. He defeated his domestic enemies, executed the opposition, and made himself dictator of Rome, the first man to hold that office not in response to a crisis, but as the prize of a civil war he had personally started and personally won. This is the dangerous legacy of Chaeronea that historians rarely emphasize enough. But the battle proved that Roman republican institutions could not contain a sufficiently capable general with a sufficiently loyal army. Sulla did not set out to create a template for the destruction of the Republic, but he did. Julius Caesar read the history carefully. So did Pompey, so did Mark Antony, so did Octavian, who would one day call himself Augustus and quietly bury the Republic in the garden of his own family's prosperity. Every step that Rome took from the Battle of Chaeronea to the establishment of the Principate follows a trail that begins with the specific lesson that Sulla taught on a Greek plain in the summer of 86 BC, that the law is what the man with the best army says it is, and for the art of war itself, Chaeronea was a funeral. The Sarissa phalanx, Alexander's great inheritance, the weapon that had conquered from Greece to India, the geometric engine that had defined Hellenistic warfare for over 2 centuries, died on the plain of Chaeronea. It did not die because it was poorly wielded. Archelaus used it well. It died because the Roman legion was simply better, more flexible, more adaptable, capable of responding to flank attacks and unexpected threats in ways that a formation locked into geometric precision could not match. Chaeronea was the moment the ancient world received its verdict on the 2 great infantry systems of the Mediterranean, and the verdict was permanent. Centuries later, in 1991, a team of Greek archaeologists digging in a field outside the modern town of Chaeronea, a field that locals had always known as a place where the earth occasionally returned old metal, uncovered one of Sulla's victory trophies. Stone, worn by 20 centuries of weather, still bearing traces of the inscription that Plutarch had described. Ares, Nike, Aphrodite, the names of the gods who had apparently watched 30,000 Romans destroy an army 4 times their size and found it pleasing. In 2004, a second trophy was found near Orchomenos. Today, the plain is farmland again. The Cephissus still runs through the valley, smaller now than it was in antiquity, its course shifted by 2,000 years of floods and silting. Farmers plant wheat where the phalanx advanced. The hills where Sulla positioned his reserves are covered in scrubby Greek oak. The road through the valley is modern asphalt, but the ground remembers. Stand there in the summer, when the heat is the same heat that burned on that morning in 86 BC. And the dust still rises from dry earth in the same way it rose when 60,000 men started marching, and the valley walls still channel the wind into the same corridors that channeled the sound of Roman trumpets and Pontic war drums. And you understand why Plutarch, who grew up hearing stories of this place from men whose grandfathers had watched it happen, devoted more pages to this battle than almost any other in his entire body of work. Some days reach through time. 30,000 soldiers held by discipline, led by a man the law had abandoned, on ground they had chosen with perfect care against an enemy that should have crushed them before breakfast. They did not break. That is all it takes. Sometimes that is everything. If this story got under your skin, the way it gets under mine, share it with someone who thinks history is boring. They are wrong, and you now have evidence. Subscribe if you haven't. We will be back next week with another battle that changed the world, and I will see you there.